Psalm 127. We were looking at that psalm last week, and there's some thought that it should be divided after verse 2, and that verses 3 through 5 better fit with Psalm 128. Now, these psalms are all kin one to another. These 15 psalms that are called songs of degrees or songs of ascent. So I think that we should expect some of them to have a kinship to the next one to it. But anyway, we want to start again at verse 3 of Psalm 127, because this rest of this psalm and the next psalm have to do with family and the value of family relationships. And this is what we're going to be looking at tonight. We probably will spend more time in some other places than we will just in the Psalms. But let's read these three verses. 127, verse 3. Lo, children are a heritage from the Lord, and the fruit of the womb is his reward. It's a common teaching throughout the Bible that our progeny represent gifts from God, and that it's a great blessing to have progeny. Angels don't procreate. There's never been a time when an angel had a little angel, and each angel is created individually. And we have the privilege of procreation, that is, bringing in others of our kind. And we're going to realize one day the privilege that this is for the human race, a very special privilege. And the Bible has quite a lot to say about that. And these are some of the words speaking of this privilege. But we're also going to learn, or we're going to reiterate, that privilege begets responsibility. And you can't have privilege without having accompanying responsibility. Verse 4, that is, of 127, as arrows are in the hand of a mighty man, so are children of one's youth. In the old economy, it was definitely a matter of strength. Someone that didn't have any children were considered as having no future, and they weren't important. And the importance was measured by your children. And it says here that they're like arrows in the hand of a mighty man, that is, the children of the youth. Some young people that come to me for advice look at me rather startled when I say, well, I think you ought to go ahead and get married. And the advice that's been given to them, you better be very careful now, you better be careful now, you got to rush into things. And when you get married, start having some young'uns. You know, the big thing is now you're supposed to wait at least 5 or 6 years. And I guess I must have come before that time, because our first child came on the scene in time for our first anniversary. And so we didn't think in terms of waiting to start a family. And I believe that's scriptural. I don't know how much I can do towards convincing the young people of our day, but it says right here, as arrows are in the hand of a mighty man, so are children of one's youth. Well, that doesn't seem to speak towards waiting until you get old and established and whatever. Happy is the man who has his quiver full of them. They shall not be ashamed, but they shall speak with the enemies in the gate. there's an amount of respect that comes from the children. It's beginning to amaze me the amount of reverence my children give me now. They didn't, when they were teenagers. By the way, I reached quite a milestone this last week. On the 27th day of January, for the first time in 18 and a half years, we don't have a teenager. The last teenager got to be 20 years old, and we hadn't been without one for 18 years. So I kind of bragged about that giving me some status as an expert on teenagers. But I guess I'm now an ex-expert on teenagers. Well,
He used to call me the old man.
Oh, I used to call you the old man?
Yeah.
Oh, well, forgive me. I'll apologize.
Well, he didn't apologize.
Well, anyway, it amazes me the amount of honor your kids begin to give you as they get a little older, especially as they become parents, and they get a different insight in the relationships. Verse 1, chapter 128, or Psalm 120, Blessed is everyone that fears the Lord, that walks in his ways, for thou shalt eat the labor of thine hands. Happy shalt thou be, and it shall be well with thee. Thy wife shall be as a fruitful vine by the sides of thine house, thy children like olive plants round about thy table. Now this children like olive plants is another way of saying that they're arrows in the hand of a mighty man. There's strength. But the emphasis here is that you have power with God, or the power of God, because the olive, when it's used figuratively, stands for the empowering of the Holy Spirit of God. Now that, and one is said to be an olive plant when he's being used by God, when God's power is going through him. Let's look at some verses that will help us to understand that. In Psalm 52, verse 8, the psalmist says, But I am like a green olive tree in the house of God. I trust in the mercy of God forever and ever. Now what he's saying is that when I have regard for God and the things of God, that makes me like an olive tree. I have the power to do things. I am like a green olive tree. Remember, Jesus saying something like that, if they do this in a green tree, what shall they do in a dry? Well, what he meant was that when the people crucified him, the authorities and so forth, they were crucifying somebody that had power. And he wanted them to think about that. Why is this? If I am a green tree, why is it they can crucify me? Well, they couldn't have, because he was a green tree. And he means a green olive tree, because this is where he got the reference from. Now look at another verse in, got to find it first, in Psalm 1, no, that's not what I want. I want Jeremiah chapter 11. Jeremiah 11, 16. the Lord call thy name. The prophet now is speaking for God, and he's speaking of Israel, the nation, or Judah. He's saying, the Lord call thy name a green olive tree, fair and goodly fruit. Now what this means is that it was God's program to empower the nation of Israel and do his work through them. They were to be a green olive tree, fair and goodly fruit. With the noise of great tumult he hath kindled fire upon it, and the branches of it are broken. He says now, he's broken off the branches because they didn't bring forth the right kind of fruit. And he's going to graft some other branches in so that he'll have fruit. He's going to empower somebody else. For the Lord of hosts who planted thee hath pronounced evil against thee. Now, God planted Israel like a green tree, a green olive tree, that he might show his power through Israel. Israel disdained that, and so God is not going to use that. So he sent Christ as the green olive tree, but he was cut off, and God's still going to have a green olive tree. Before we go to the New Testament and see the New Testament comment, we'll stop by Hosea chapter 14. You know, we're teaching Hosea verse by verse every Monday night in Sebring, and it has 14 short chapters. And I thought surely that, we could do that 14 chapters in 7 lessons, 2 chapters to the lesson. But we have found so much depth there, and especially the picturesque speech. I think there's more figurative language very picturesque type figurative language in there. And we discovered one thing, Israel and Ephraim are both the names of the northern empire in the northern kingdom in Hosea. And God says Israel, when he's talking about his people in their relationship with him, even when they're going away from him. And he calls them Ephraim when they have a relationship with their idols. In other words, Israel is departing from him, and Ephraim is going to their idols. It's really amazing how that is. You see, look in chapter 7, verse 1. When I would have healed Israel, then the iniquity of Ephraim was uncovered. Well, Israel and Ephraim are the same, but the connotation is different. See, like in chapter 4, verse 16, Israel slides back like a backsliding heifer, speaking about their relationship to God. But Ephraim is joined to his idols. And we ran across that, and we just proved it all the way through. And it was so interesting to find some of those things. And we found a number of those. And we found Ephraim and Israel likened to so many things. Like in Hosea chapter 10, Israel is an empty vine. And there's so much of that type of picture. But one day, Israel is going to be a green olive tree again. See, in Jeremiah, God says they were a green olive tree, but he cut off the branches, and he's going to destroy the tree. But look in Hosea chapter 14, verse 4. I will heal their backsliding. I will love them freely, for mine anger is turned away from him. I will be as the dew unto Israel. He shall grow like the lily and cast forth his roots like Lebanon. His branches shall spread, and his beauty shall be like the olive tree. God's going to use Israel again. Now, look at the New Testament interpretation of that, and it'll bring us into it in Romans chapter 11. Romans 11. Start with verse 16. For if the first fruit be holy, the lump is also holy. And if the root be holy, so are the branches. And if some of the branches be broken off. See, Jeremiah says some branches of the tree were being broken off. And he says if some of the branches are broken off, and thou, that's us, being a wild olive. See, we were wild olives. Before we were saved, we got our power from somewhere else, not from God. We were wild olives. But you were grafted in among them, that is Israel, that was to be the good olive tree, and with them you partake of the root and fatness of the olive tree. Now, this is speaking of us as being the sons of Abraham by faith through Christ Jesus. Boast not against the branches, that is, don't think you're so much better than Israel that's been cut off. But if thou boast, thou bearest not the root, but the root you. In other words, let's suppose you think about a limb out on the olive tree. What could that limb do in the way of bearing olives if there weren't any root? And see, the Lord's calling himself the root. And so he says, boast not against the branches. In other words, don't say, well, look what I'm doing for God, and they're not doing anything anymore. Because you're not the root, you're the branch. And you don't have any life in you, any power, except as you're attached to the root. Thou wilt say then, the branches were broken off that I might be grafted in. Well, because of unbelief they were broken off, and thou standest by faith, but not high-minded. Be not high-minded, but fear. For if God spared not the natural branches, take heed lest he also spare not thee. Behold, therefore, the goodness and the severity of God. On them who fell, severity, but toward thee, goodness, if thou continue in his goodness, otherwise thou also shalt be cut off. And they also, if they abide not still in unbelief, shall be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. For if thou wert cut out of the olive tree which is wild by nature, and was grafted contrary to nature into a good olive tree, how much more shall these, who are the natural branches, be grafted into their own olive tree? Now this is all figurative language, isn't it? Well, Paul knew the Old Testament, and the Holy Spirit was able to use him because of that knowledge, to take these Old Testament allusions. And the pity of it is that we spend so little time in the Old Testament that we don't know how to do that. We read this in Romans 11, we say, what's that? Must be significant. What's the significance? Well, it's found in the Old Testament, the significance is. That's why there's such a dearth of knowledge concerning the deep things of the Lord, because not enough time is spent in the Old Testament. If you see the olive tree used as a figure in the New Testament, it ought to cause you to start hunting in the Old Testament and see where it comes from. So in summary, this is it. God says, I had something I wanted to do on earth. I wanted to show my power. And I was going to show my power through the nation of Israel. But they wouldn't yield themselves to be used. So I'm holy, and they were unholy. So I had to cut them off from my tree. But I still wanted olives, or I wanted to show my power on earth. So I sent my son, and he was the green olive tree. But he was cut off too for a purpose. But I still want olives. So what does he do? He says, I go and find some wild olives. They're bearing fruit, but the wrong kind. and I cut them off of their wild tree and graft them into my good tree. He says, that's you. The reason you got grafted in because the branches were cut off weren't doing the job. He says, now, don't you think I'll cut you off if you don't do the job? Somebody says, well, that's teaching that you'll lose your salvation. We're not talking about that. We're not talking about Israel losing its salvation. They're going to be grafted back in. We're talking about whether or not God will exercise his power through someone. That's what we're talking about. And to be cut off from the olive tree is to lose your opportunity to do God's work. Paul taught that. He talked about he stayed under his body lest he be a castaway and such things as that. Now, when we leave here, is God going to have any olive trees on earth to do his work? Who's that going to be? Huh? Well, let's look at Revelation chapter 11. See, if we know the typical language that has its root in the Old Testament, then we can understand what the New Testament says. In Revelation 11:3, and I will give power unto my 2 witnesses, and they shall prophesy 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. These are 2 olive trees. Well, ain't that something? He's going to give them power, and they're 2 olive trees. Now that fits right into the whole business, doesn't it? And the 2 lampstands standing before the God of the earth, and if any man will hurt them, fire will proceed. He's going to have somebody right here doing his work. It is right, he's going to have Israel doing his work. But at the middle of the tribulation, the remnant of Israel, they will have the 144,000 Israelites, they will have brought millions to Christ. But they're going to be pursued. They're going to have to go and hide. In the last 3.5 years, they're not going to minister. But God's still going to show his power on this earth. He's going to have some olive trees. You see, after we're raptured, he's going to graft the good limbs back in. That's the 144,000. And they'll do his work on earth. But then they're going to go in hiding. But he's got 2 olive trees still. And there they are, right there. That's how you can know that the 2 witnesses of Revelation 11 are going to witness during the last half of the tribulation. That's one of the ways you can know that. I was just reading just the other day one of the best Bible teachers in the country, and I was just amazed to see him say that the 2 witnesses would be ministering during the same time as 144,000. And he gave some scriptures to me which weren't even on the subject. But it just amazed me that he couldn't see that here's the 2 olive trees for the last half. Of course, they're prophesied, you know, back in Zechariah chapter 4. It's just a matter, in doing these things, it's just a matter of comparing Scripture with Scripture. See, in Zechariah chapter 4, verse 3, and 2 olive trees by it, one upon the right hand and both. Now, Zechariah wanted to know who in the world those 2 olive trees were. And he asked what that meant. And the Lord told him what it meant. In verse 11, in Zechariah 4. Then answered I and said unto him, what are these 2 olive trees upon the right side of the lampstand, upon the left side of it? And I answered again and said unto him, what are these 2 olive branches which through the 2 golden pipes empty the golden oil out of them? And he answered me and said, knowest thou not what these are? And I said, no, my Lord. Then he said, these are the 2 anointed ones that shall stand by the Lord of the whole earth. Now, This is prophetic of the two witnesses in Revelation chapter 11. Didn't know there's so much in the Bible about green olive trees, did you? But and there's a lot more about the oil and the wine and the olive tree and so forth. But it all ties in together, and when we get it all tied together, then we know what it's saying. Somebody said, "You're always talking about Bible typology. Aren't you afraid you'll be spiritualizing?" I was telling the figurative meaning of the creation. Isn't that spiritualizing? No, spiritualizing is when you say an account in the Bible is not fact. Like you say the creation story is not a fact at all. It's just an allegory that's it's a way of saying some other type of truth in parabolic language. Whereas to find the figurative meaning, what you do, you say this is exactly, literally so, just like it says, but it has spiritual implications, figurative meaning. In the Bible, some figurative language is just strictly figurative, but some of it is literal and figurative both at the same time. And the Spirit does it that way on purpose. Well, we found the olive plants. When you got children are like olive plants around thy table. Well, next time you just see all your youngins around the table, I didn't know those were olive plants. Well, that's what they are. Did you know what it means is that the time's going to come when you won't be able to do anything for God in this world except what you've done in and through those young people. They're your heritage, and they're here to do when you're not here anymore to do. And that's where your strength is. Now, lest some of you that might have been led to an unmarried life, when the Bible speaks to this issue, it says you can have children. Because, you see, there's so many people out in the world that their parents didn't tell them how to be an olive tree, that you have that opportunity, and then God gives those to you for children. And there's a lot of them around, so you needn't think you're getting left out. 128, verse 4, Behold, that thus shall the man be blessed who fears the Lord shall bless thee out of Zion, and thou shalt see the good of Jerusalem all the days of thy life. Yea, thou shalt see thy children's children. Well, you've got to live a little while to see your children's children, don't you? I suppose you at least got to be in your late 30s, even if you got in a hurry. And peace upon Israel. Then remember we saw that grandparents' verse in Proverbs 13:22. A good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children, and the wealth of sinners laid up. That's not the one I wanted. Proverbs 17:6. Children's children are the crown of old men, and the glory of children are their fathers. Now I want to take through some scriptures that will show us the importance God places on the family as a unit. Genesis chapter 7. Verse 1. And the Lord said unto Noah, Come thou and all thy house into the ark. For thee have I seen righteous before me in this generation. Now, it was Noah that God saw to be righteous, but he brought his whole house into the ark. His wife, and his 3 sons, and his 3 daughters-in-law. They were all privileged because of the righteousness of Noah. Now, I don't want to try to explain all the implications of that, but we're just going to trace some of this down. Genesis 18:19. Abraham, God is saying something about Abraham. Look first in verse 17 of Genesis 18. And the Lord said, Shall I hide from Abraham that thing which I do, seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him? Why? For I know him that he will command his children and his household after him, and they shall keep the way of the Lord, to do righteousness and justice, that the Lord may bring upon Abraham that which he has spoken of him. And that's why Abraham was called the friend of God. That's why Abraham was given the sign of circumcision. He knew when Abraham instituted circumcision, he was making a covenant with God that whatever proceeds forth from my body, whoever my progeny is to be, I'm going to tell him the way of the Lord. And not only that, but I'm going to circumcise him and explain that he has the same responsibility. That's why when Moses wanted to do the work of the Lord, and his 2 sons had not been circumcised because he had a Midianite for a wife, he didn't understand those things. And Abraham and God said to Moses, Moses, if you don't circumcise those 2 sons, you're a dead man. And when Moses went and told Zipporah, his wife, that, well, she did the job herself. But Moses was the son of Abraham and must keep the covenant. Genesis 35:2. We're just going to take a little trip here. Then Jacob said unto his household and to all that were with him, Put away the strange gods that are among you, and be clean, and change garments. He was running the show for the whole household. What some modern fathers ought to take example of that. If you go around witnessing, inviting people to come to the service or something at the gathering of the saints, you'd be surprised how many people would say, would actually give you this excuse. Well, they stopped going to church when their kids got up about so old because they didn't want to over-influence their children. They wanted them to have the opportunity to choose their own church because they didn't want to influence them that way. Or we have people that we got a real good Christian school. The Lord's got it down there for the Lord's people in Lakeland. You ask some Christians sometimes, well, why don't you use the Christian school? Well, my children want to go where they are. They don't want to change. Well, how old's your child? Well, one's in the 3rd grade and one's in the 5th. They don't want to, you know. And, Jacob didn't let them make their mind up about their method of worship. He ran the show. Exodus chapter 10. Verse 9. And Moses said, we will go with our young and with our old, with our sons and with our daughters, with our flocks and with our herds. We will go, for we must hold the feast of the Lord. And he, that Pharaoh said unto them, let the Lord be with you, as I will let you go, and your little ones look to it for evil. Before, what he was saying is, well, you go do whatever you want. You worship God when you want to, but leave the kids here in the world. You know, don't try to influence them. They may not want to do that. Let them make their own decisions. That's not what Moses said. He says, we want to take our young'uns. We don't ask them if they want to go. And here's a strange one. Look in Joshua chapter 6. This harlot exercised her faith, and she wanted it to count for her whole family. Look back in Joshua chapter 2. Verse 12. Now therefore I pray you, swear unto me by the Lord, since I have shown you kindness, that you will also show kindness unto my father's house. She looked upon herself as part of her father's house. And give me a true token, and that ye will save alive my father, my mother, my brethren, my sisters, and all that they have, and deliver our lives from death. Verse 18, for behold, we come into the land, thou shalt bind this line on scarlet thread in the window by which thou didst let us down, and thou shalt bring thy father and thy mother and thy brethren and all thy father's household. She was the one that had faith, but she was the saving of her whole household. In Joshua 24. Joshua says, if it seem evil unto you to serve the Lord, choose you this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. He says, I'm going to serve the Lord and then see what the young'uns want to do. He didn't say that. In Judges chapter 1, verse 25. And when he showed them the entrance into the city, they smote the city with the edge of the sword, but they let go the man and all his family. That was, everybody else in the city was destroyed, just like in Jericho. In the New Testament, Luke chapter 19. I'm running out of time. Is the reason we had to skip over some here. Luke chapter 19. Verse 5. And when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and saw him, and said unto him, Zacchaeus, make haste, and come down, for today I must abide at thy house. And he made haste, and came down, received him joyfully. And when they saw it, they all murmured, saying, he was gone to be the guest with a man that's a sinner. That's what happened to me one day. Christ came to be the guest of a man that was a sinner. And Zacchaeus stood and said unto the Lord, Behold, Lord, the half of my goods I give to the poor, and if I have taken anything from any man by false accusation, I will restore him fourfold. And Jesus said unto him, This day is salvation come to this house. So you see, he didn't say to you, he said to your house. In John chapter 4, verse 53. So the Father knew that it was at the same hour in which Jesus said unto him, Thy son liveth, and he himself believed, and his whole house. His whole house. Acts chapter 11, verse 14. God said to Cornelius in 11, chapter 11, verse 14, Who shall tell thee words by which thou and all thy house shall be saved. Everybody in his house said, all thy house will be saved. That's kind of a repeat of in chapter 10, verse 24, the last part of that verse said that he called together his kinsmen and his friends. Now in Acts 16, 15. This is about Lydia. And when she was baptized, and her household. And chapter 16, verse 30. And brought them out and said, Sirs, what must I do to be saved? And they said, Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and thou shalt be saved, and thy house. Verse 34. And when he had brought them into his house, he set meat before them, and rejoiced, believing in God with all his house. Isn't that interesting? In Acts 18, chapter 8, And Crispus, the chief ruler of the synagogue, believed on the Lord with all his house. And, must mean something. Now, it goes the other way around, too. Well, just think of some stories. You remember Lot the Bible says he was a saved man, took his wife and his daughters and went to Sodom. And he lost his whole his testimony and everything with his whole household. But when it came time to save them, remember the angels came and says, tell your whole household, let's get out of here. Invited his sons-in-law and all, and they mocked him. But Lot had a responsibility, and he didn't fulfill it because he wasn't a right kind of a testimony. How about this fellow, Achan, in Joshua 7:24? Now, some people say this is a pretty bad story. Joshua 7:24, and Joshua and all the children of Israel with him took Achan, the son of Zerah, and the silver and the garments and the wedge of gold, and his sons and his daughters and his oxen and his asses and his sheep and his tent and all that he had, And they brought them unto the valley of Achor. And Joshua said, Why hast thou troubled us? The Lord shall trouble thee this day. And all Israel stoned him with stones, and burned them with fire, after they had stoned them with stones. And they raised over him a great heap of stones unto this day. So the Lord turned from the fierceness of his anger, wherefore the name of that place was called the Valley of Achor. Well, that's not very fair, is it? Took all of his wife, children, everybody. Stoned them. And nobody sinned but Achor. Okay, let's look at another one. In Daniel, chapter 6, verse 24. Everybody knew that in Daniel chapter 6, Daniel got saved out of the lion's den. But did you remember this? Verse 24. And the king commanded, and they brought those men who had accused Daniel, and they cast them into the lion's den, them, their children, and their wives. And the lions had the master of them, and broke all their bones to pieces ere they came to the bottom of the den. Their whole families got destroyed. Well, what this is teaching is just this, that if you bring children into this world and then you lead them away from God, you're responsible for them going to hell. Because if you hadn't brought them in the world, they wouldn't have gone to hell. And the implications are rather grave there. You say, you mean to tell me that if I get saved, I can be sure that all of my family gets saved? And how broad is that? That includes my children, or how about my grandchildren? Or how about my first cousins? Just how far does that go? Well, what the truth is teaching here is that wherever you have an area of responsibility, Lot had an area of responsibility, and Achan had an area of responsibility, and those men that cooked up that deal on old Daniel, they had an area of responsibility. And where you have an area of responsibility, that you are going to suffer if you don't fulfill that area of responsibility, and those that are under your tutelage, those that you're responsible for, are going to suffer because of it. That shouldn't surprise us a lot. Suppose a man, the father is a drunkard. Suppose you had a man that inherited a lot of money. Then he became an alcoholic, got 3 kids, but threw all the money away. They lost it. He didn't just lose it for himself. Did somebody come around and say, look, your father lost all that money, and it wasn't your fault, so here, we're going to give it back to you? No, he loses it. They lose it in him. So we can understand that very well with material things. But there is a sense in which that is true in spiritual things, in eternal heritages. Now, God is gracious, and He doesn't deny His salvation from anybody. But children that are born into a Christian home that's a witnessing Christian home are very privileged, aren't they? Because they're under the sound of that gospel. And that's why God doesn't want anybody running His affairs that doesn't first know how to use the Word of God to run their children's affairs. And this is something that the Church of the Lord Jesus Christ just pays no attention to, and it amazes me because it's so clear. And we find it in 1 Timothy, for instance. It's also in Titus. But when it's given the qualifications in 1 Timothy chapter 3 to a bishop, which is what we call an elder, it says in verse 4, one that rules well his own house, having his children in subjection with all gravity. It's an amazing thing how the Roman Catholic Church says the priest is not supposed to marry, and he's holding himself out to be an elder, and it says right here, have his children in subjugation. How can he have his children in subjection if he doesn't have his children? We need our spiritual leaders, the ones that are telling others how to do it, they need to be family men that know how to lead others. There's plenty of things for men to do that aren't family men. They could be evangelists or something else. But if the people that are given the responsibility to run the family of God need to be people who've proven that they can run a family. And that's what that says. It's just very plain. One that rules well his own household. That's what God said about Abraham. I'm selecting him to be the leader because I know that he will lead his own household. Talks about a deacon, which is a lesser steward of God's things in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 12. Let the deacons be husbands of one wife, ruling their children and their houses well. This is pretty powerful back in verse 5. For if a man know not how to rule his own house, how shall he take care of the church of God? I know of a minister, and his oldest daughter went plumb wild. She got kicked out of public school and 2 private schools and went plumb wild. And then next thing you know, the boy was following in their steps. And so some of the people in the church said, well, we better ask him to step aside in view of this. And the church wouldn't have anything to do with that. They said, well, he can't help that. That's not his fault. The Bible says you're not permitted to be a spiritual leader if you can't run your own household. That's what God says. And we need to look at the root of why he says that. Now, beyond all of that, if we don't come to any other conclusion, we ought to conclude that God has some very special eternal purpose in family units. Or he wouldn't use that kind of language so much. Darius and his whole household, Crispus and his whole household, the Philippian jailer and his whole household, Lydia and her whole household. There wouldn't be that much there if God didn't have some sort of purpose eternally in family units. And if you're saved, and somebody in your family, especially your immediate family, is not saved, well, I'd say that's about the most profitable person you could pray for. Because if God foreknows, I believe this with all my heart, if God foreknows that you will be a person who will pour out your heart to him, claiming the salvation of your very close ones, then he just wouldn't have let anybody be born into your family that he wasn't going to save, or that he didn't foreknow would be saved. I mean, he can control those things from back there, you know. That may be why sometimes Christians lose a little child or something, a baby. God may foreknow that there's no way in the world you can get that child to come to Christ when he gets a little older. So he takes care of the situation that way. You want to get surprised with how God has to operate some things in order to get his work done and still deal with our own frowardness. Now, I know I've brought up more questions that I've answered tonight. and there's some of the questions about that sentence like, believe on the Lord Jesus Christ and thou shalt be saved and thy house. I don't understand all the connotations of that. But what I'm really saying is that that's in the Bible, and it's so many times that we ought to think about it at least. If we don't think any more about it than to have questions about it. Now, I don't know why I was so privileged. God saved me first in my house, in my own household. When I was saved, I was 35 years old. My youngest child was less than a year old. And 3 months after I was saved, my wife was saved. I didn't personally lead her to Christ, but I took her to the meeting where she was saved. But all four of my children, when they give their testimony, they testify that their daddy led them to Christ. And, of course, this is a great source of joy to me. And I'm so thankful that they all responded. And I don't understand why some don't respond. And I'm not trying to... I don't think it's because I did so much better job of presenting the gospel. I don't think it's because God loves me more. I don't know why, but I'm grateful anyhow. I'm grateful that God placed children in my family that would receive the gospel when they heard it. And I think He placed that kind. I just think that He didn't put anybody. It wasn't His good pleasure to put anybody in my family that He would have foreknown would have rejected Him. And if you're a person that trusts God for the salvation of your family, I don't think it's in His plan to let somebody be born into your family and grow up and go to hell. Now, I know their salvation depends upon their own response to the gospel. But God's running the business of deciding who got in your family in the first place. And He could have kept anybody out He wanted to. And what I'm saying is, I don't believe He'd let anybody get in your family that wouldn't eventually be saved if He foreknew that you were going to trust Him for their salvation. I believe that's the way it works. Is that too complicated? Pray. Father, we're grateful that You let us have a part in bringing people to Yourself. And we know that there's some that have waited long, long years and prayed faithfully. But we pray, God, that this Scripture would help them to keep their faith and to believe that You're going to save their loved ones. And thank You in Jesus' name. Amen.